The winds on Tolum 4 howled like feral beasts, clawing at the edges of the outpost. Dr. Adrian Cross sat hunched over a glowing datapad, its pale light reflecting off his unshaven face. The hum of the generator in the background was the only rhythm of life he had known for months. The isolation suited him, or so he told himself. Out here, there were no expectations, no reminders of the lives he couldn't save. Adrian's quarters were Spartan, a mix of functional steel and polymer furnishings. A single cot lay unmade in the corner, its blanket rumpled and untouched since the last sleep cycle. The walls were decorated with maps of alien biospheres and sketches of species long extinct, a gallery of silent failures. His attention drifted between the flickering monitor and the swirling storm outside. The storm wasn't unusual. Tolum 4 was a barren world, its atmosphere barely hospitable, its surface a graveyard of what once might have been. He had come here after the dissolution of his career, seeking solitude under the pretense of research. But that night, something shattered the monotony. A faint blip echoed on his scanner, startling him from his reverie. Adrian frowned, tapping the screen. The scanner rarely picked up life signs. There was nothing to find on Tolum 4 except sand and regret. Yet the signal persisted, faint but steady. He leaned closer, adjusting the parameters. The reading was unmistakable, carbon-based, humanoid, approximately 3 kilometers east of the outpost. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. Grabbing his thermal jacket and a portable scanner, Adrian stepped into the airlock. The doors hissed open, releasing him into the chaos of the storm. Sand and ice pelted his visor, and his boots crunched against the frozen ground as he trudged toward the anomaly. The journey was grueling, the storm a relentless adversary. Visibility was minimal, and the signal flickered erratically, almost as though the source were moving. His heartbeat quickened, a mix of curiosity and unease tightening in his chest. Who, or what, could survive out here? After nearly an hour of battling the elements, Adrian stumbled into a shallow canyon. The wind lessened, muffled by the natural walls. He scanned the area, his gloved fingers trembling as the signal spiked. Then he saw her. At first, she was just a shadow, crouched and still, her silhouette blending with the jagged rocks. But as he stepped closer, details emerged, elongated limbs, a lithe frame draped in what looked like organic fibers, and skin that shimmered faintly, like starlight trapped beneath translucent glass. Her eyes snapped to him, wide and luminescent, reflecting his figure like twin moons. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, almost feline. Adrian froze, his breath caught in his throat. She was alien, unmistakably so. Her features were both beautiful and otherworldly, high cheekbones, delicate ridges that adorned her temples, and hair that cascaded like liquid silver. Her gaze was wary but not hostile, her posture tense yet pleading. Adrian took a cautious step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice muffled by the storm and his helmet. She didn't respond, but her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying him, weighing his intent. "Can you understand me?" he tried again, his voice softer this time. She blinked, her lips parting. Her voice, when it came, was melodic but fractured, as though she were stringing together fragments of a language she barely knew. "Who, man?" Adrian's eyes widened. "Yes, I'm human." He took another step, his heart pounding. "Who are you? How did you get here?" She hesitated, her gaze darting between him and the storm beyond. Then, slowly, she raised her hand to her chest and spoke a single word. "Lerai." Her name, he guessed. "I'm Adrian," he said, tapping his own chest. "Adrian Cross." Her lips moved, mimicking the shape of his name without sound. There was a fragility to her, as though the storm might sweep her away if she didn't hold her ground. Adrian gestured toward the direction of his outpost. "You need shelter. Come with me." For a moment, she didn't move, her expression unreadable. Then, with a faint nod, she stepped forward, her movements hesitant but deliberate. The walk back was agonizingly slow. The storm had intensified, and Adrian found himself shielding Lerai from the worst of it, her smaller frame vulnerable against the unrelenting winds. She clung to him, her touch feather-light but firm, and he couldn't ignore the strange warmth that radiated from her skin despite the frigid air. By the time they reached the outpost, both were trembling, though for different reasons. Adrian sealed the airlock and removed his helmet, turning to face her. Larai stood in the dim light, her alien beauty even more striking in the sterile surroundings. She shivered, clutching her makeshift clothing, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Adrian grabbed a thermal blanket from a storage unit and approached her cautiously. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders. She flinched at first but then relaxed, her fingers brushing against the fabric as though she'd never felt anything like it before. "Safe," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Yes, you're safe," Adrian replied, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. As he prepared a cup of nutrient broth, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? How had she survived on this desolate planet? And why had she sought him out? But the most pressing question came when she finally spoke again, her voice trembling but resolute. "Help me." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Adrian met her gaze, the desperation in her luminous eyes cutting through him like a blade. He nodded slowly, though he knew that whatever she needed, it would change his life, and hers, forever. The storm raged outside, its ferocity muffled by the reinforced walls of the outpost. Inside, Adrian watched Larai from across the room, his mind a maelstrom of questions. She sat on the edge of his cot, wrapped in the thermal blanket, her gaze fixed on the flickering heater unit. Her posture was stiff, her hands clutching the fabric like a lifeline. She was alien, yet her presence stirred something deeply familiar in him, a vulnerability, a desperation he couldn't ignore. Her earlier plea, "Help me," echoed in his mind. But help her how? "Are you injured?" he asked gently, breaking the heavy silence. Larai's gaze shifted to him, her luminous eyes catching the light like polished gemstones. She hesitated, her lips moving as if she were searching for the right words. Finally, she shook her head. "No, not hurt. Weak." Her voice was fragmented, each word deliberate, as though the language itself was a struggle. Adrian nodded, setting a cup of steaming broth on the table near her. "This will help. Drink." She leaned forward cautiously, her movements tentative. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cup, and she sniffed its contents before taking a small sip. A faint hum of approval escaped her lips, and she took another, longer sip. He sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Larai, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" Her gaze dropped to the cup in her hands. For a moment, he thought she might not answer, but then she spoke, her words halting but resolute. "Last of kind. No more like me." Adrian's chest tightened. He leaned forward. "You're the last of your species." She nodded slowly, her silver hair falling over her face. "War, disease, ended us." Her voice quivered, but she steadied herself, her hands clutching the cup tightly. "I survive. Alone." Adrian felt a pang of guilt for the countless times he had wallowed in self-pity over his own failures. Whatever he had endured paled in comparison to what she described. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. Larai looked up, her expression unreadable. "Not need, sorry. Need help." The urgency in her voice cut through him. "What kind of help?" She set the cup down and stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders to reveal her slender form. She took a step toward him, her movements deliberate, her gaze unwavering. "Breed." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Adrian stared at her, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. "What?" Larai tilted her head, her expression calm but determined. "Need new life. New generation. You a help." Adrian stood abruptly, backing away a step. "Hold on. You're asking me to help you repopulate your species." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Human, compatible. Can work. Must work." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small room. This is insane. I don't even know if that's possible. And even if it is," he stopped, turning to face her. "Why me? Why come here?" Larai's eyes softened, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in her composure. "You, last hope. No others. No time." Her words were like a weight pressing down on him. He wanted to argue, to push back against the impossibility of what she was asking, but the desperation in her eyes silenced him. "What happens if I say no?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Then, end. Species gone. Forever. Adrian felt a lump in his throat. He had come to Tallum 4 to escape his failures, to bury himself in solitude and avoid the burden of responsibility. And now, fate had thrust upon him a decision with stakes far greater than he had ever faced. He sank into the chair, rubbing his temples. This is a lot to process. Larai stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She knelt before him, her hands resting lightly on his knees. The warmth of her touch startled him, and he looked up to meet her gaze. "Not just for me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "For all who were. For all who could be." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. Adrian stared at her, his mind racing. "I need to think," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Larai nodded and stood, retreating to the cot. She lay down, her back to him, her form small and fragile against the stark backdrop of the room. Adrian watched her for a long time, the storm outside echoing the turmoil within him. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. Adrian busied himself with routine tasks, checking the generator, organizing supplies, but his mind remained fixated on Larai. Her presence was a constant, unspoken reminder of the decision he faced. As the storm began to abate, he found himself standing by the window, staring out at the desolate landscape. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, tired and haunted. He thought of Earth, of the life he had left behind. The mistakes, the regrets, the people he had failed. And now, here he was, faced with a choice that could determine the fate of an entire species. The sound of movement drew his attention. He turned to see Larai standing behind him, her expression unreadable. "Storm, calm," she said quietly. He nodded. "For now." She took a step closer, her gaze searching his. "Decision." Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't just a decision, Larai. It's monumental. If I agree, it's not just about helping you. It's about committing to something I don't fully understand." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Understand fear. But more afraid of nothing. Of end." Her words struck a chord, and Adrian felt his resolve falter. He had spent so long running from his past, from the weight of responsibility. Maybe it was time to stop running. "I need to understand more," he said finally. "If we're going to do this, I need to know everything. How it works. What it means." Larai's lips curved into a faint, hopeful smile. "We'll explain. We'll show." Adrian nodded, a mix of apprehension and determination settling over him. Whatever came next, he knew there was no turning back. Adrian sat at the small table, the dim light of the heater casting shadows across the room. Larai stood across from him, her silver hair catching the faint glow. Between them, the table was strewn with equipment she had retrieved from her ship, a collection of sleek, alien devices that hummed faintly, their surfaces alive with pulsing energy. "This," Larai began, pointing to a cylindrical object that shimmered in hues of blue and green, "is key. Genetic synthesizer. Adapts you to me." Adrian frowned, his arms crossed. "Adapts? You mean it alters DNA?" Larai nodded, her expression solemn. "Not change. Merge. Bridge gap between species." He leaned back in his chair, his skepticism clear. "And you're sure this works? You've done this before." Her eyes darkened, and for a moment he thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, "Theory, proven. Practice, not yet." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "So, I'd be the first human to try this. That's comforting." Larai tilted her head, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. "Risk, mutual. For me, too." Her words gave him pause. She wasn't asking him to take a step she wasn't willing to take herself. Still, the gravity of what she was proposing felt overwhelming. He gestured toward the other devices. "What about the rest of this? What does it do?" Larai picked up a thin, translucent tablet and tapped its surface. A holographic projection appeared, displaying intricate patterns of light and color. She pointed to a swirling design at the center. "This life code. Mine. Yours." She tapped again, and the patterns shifted, intertwining like a double helix. "Must align. Harmonize." Adrian stared at the projection, his mind struggling to comprehend the complexity of what she was showing him. And if it doesn't align? Larai hesitated, her hands clutching the tablet tightly. Failure, possible. Pain, likely. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You're not making this any easier. She stepped closer, her expression softening. Not easy, but necessary. For me. For future. Her proximity unsettled him, not because he felt threatened, but because he felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Her presence was magnetic, her desperation a silent plea that tugged at something deep within him. Why me? He asked, his voice quieter this time. Out of all the humans you could have found, why did you choose me? Larai's gaze met his, and for the first time, her stoic facade seemed to crack. Not choose. Chance. Found. Beacon. Your outpost. He frowned. You mean the emergency signal? That was deactivated months ago. She nodded. Signal, faint. Old. Still, enough. Adrian shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. So, I'm here because of a malfunction. Figures. Larai didn't respond, but her eyes held his, unyielding. Her silence spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgment of the randomness of their meeting and the immense weight of what it had led to. The hours bled into one another as Larai explained the process in fragmented, halting English. Adrian listened intently, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to a reluctant understanding. The devices were advanced beyond anything he had ever seen, their purpose clear despite their alien design. As the storm outside finally began to subside, Larai set the last of the equipment aside and turned to him. Time, soon. Must decide. Adrian leaned against the table, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. He wanted to say no, to refuse the impossible task she was asking of him. But the image of her, alone, desperate, clinging to the last thread of hope, refused to leave his mind. He sighed, rubbing his temples. If we do this, what happens next? What's the long-term plan? Larai hesitated, her expression distant. Long-term, uncertain. First, survival. Then, rebuild. Her honesty struck him. She wasn't promising miracles or guaranteeing success. She was simply asking for a chance to fight against extinction. Adrian looked at her, his gaze searching. You're putting a lot of faith in a stranger. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Not stranger now. He laughed softly, shaking his head. I guess not. The room was quiet as Larai prepared the synthesizer, its soft hum filling the air. Adrian sat on the edge of the cot, his hands clasped tightly together. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but he had made up his mind. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady. Let's do this. Larai turned to him, her expression unreadable. She stepped closer, holding the cylindrical device in her hands. Hold still. Will not hurt. Much. Adrian raised an eyebrow. That's reassuring. She placed the device against his chest, and he felt a faint warmth spread through him. The hum grew louder, resonating in his bones. His vision blurred for a moment, and he clenched his fists, his breathing shallow. It's working, Larai said softly, her voice distant. The warmth turned to heat, coursing through his veins like liquid fire. He gritted his teeth, his body trembling under the intensity. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. He sagged forward, his breathing ragged. What the hell was that? Larai knelt beside him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. Adaptation. First step. Adrian looked up at her, his vision slowly clearing. And the next step. Her gaze held his, her expression solemn. Trust. The storm had passed, leaving the barren landscape outside blanketed in fresh snow. The cold seeped into the outpost despite Adrian's best efforts to keep the heater running at full power. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, the silence broken only by the faint hum of Larai's equipment. Adrian sat on the edge of his cot, his body still recovering from the effects of the genetic adaptation process. His muscles felt like they'd been put through a grinder, and a dull ache pulsed in his chest where the synthesizer had been pressed against him. Despite the discomfort, he felt different. There was an energy coursing through him that wasn't there before, an awareness he couldn't quite put into words. Larai stood near the table, her slender fingers moving deftly over the controls of her tablet. The holographic projection had changed, the once disjointed patterns now weaving together in a slow, rhythmic dance. She studied it intently, her luminous eyes narrowing as she analyzed the data. "How do I know it worked?" Adrian asked, breaking the silence. Larai turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Feel change." He hesitated. "I feel something. But I don't know if that's because of the machine or because I'm imagining things." She approached him, her movements fluid and deliberate. "Not imagination. Connection forming." Adrian frowned. "Connection." Larai crouched in front of him, her gaze level with his. "Your body adjusting. Mine too. We linked." The weight of her words hit him like a freight train. "Linked? You mean biologically? Or something else?" Her eyes softened, and she placed a hand lightly on his chest. The touch was warm, almost comforting. "Both. Life code, merging. Minds align. Minds." He leaned back slightly, his heart pounding. "Are you saying you can read my thoughts now?" She shook her head. "Not thoughts. Emotions. Intent." Adrian swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wasn't sure how he felt about the idea of someone, especially someone as alien as Larai, being able to sense his emotions. It was a level of vulnerability he wasn't used to, and it made him uneasy. Larai seemed to sense his discomfort. She withdrew her hand and stood, her expression unreadable once more. "Trust. Difficult." "I know." Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just about trust. This whole thing, it's a lot to process." She nodded slowly. "For me, too." The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. For all her advanced technology and otherworldly presence, she was just as uncertain, just as vulnerable as he was. The thought made her seem less alien, more relatable. As the day wore on, Adrian found himself drawn to Larai's quiet determination. She worked tirelessly, adjusting the equipment, analyzing data, and monitoring their progress. Despite the language barrier, they managed to communicate, their conversations punctuated by long silences that spoke volumes. At one point, Adrian joined her at the table, his curiosity getting the better of him. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to a small, circular device that pulsed faintly with light. Larai glanced at it, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Stabilizer. For bond." He raised an eyebrow. "Bond stabilizer? Sounds ominous." She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Necessary. Without a chaos." "Chaos." He leaned closer, intrigued. "What kind of chaos?" Her gaze met his, and for a moment she hesitated. "Pain. Confusion. If bond, unstable." Adrian frowned, his concern evident. "So, this bond thing, it's not guaranteed to work." "Risk," she admitted. "But worth." Her unwavering belief in the process was both reassuring and unsettling. Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that she was placing an enormous amount of faith in him, faith he wasn't sure he deserved. That night, as the temperature dropped further, Adrian found himself unable to sleep. He lay on his cot, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. The events of the past 2 days played over and over in his mind, each moment adding another layer to the puzzle. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. He sat up, his heart racing. "Yeah." The door slid open, and Larai stepped inside, her slender frame silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. She hesitated for a moment before entering fully, her eyes locking onto his. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. "Too much." He gestured to the chair by the table. "You can sit, if you want." She nodded and took the seat, her movements graceful and deliberate. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. Finally, Larai broke the silence. "Adrian, afraid?" He glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Of what?" "Future," she said simply. "What we do." He leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess I am. This whole thing, it's big. Bigger than anything I've ever dealt with before." She tilted her head, studying him. But, still here. Why? He hesitated, unsure how to answer. I guess, because I can't just walk away. If I do, then what happens to you? To your species? Her lips curved into a faint smile. Kindness, rare. In galaxy. He laughed softly. I wouldn't call it kindness. More like stubbornness. Her smile widened slightly, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to ease. But then her expression grew serious once more. Tomorrow, final step, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. Final step. She nodded. Bond, complete. No turning back. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow, everything would change. The bond they had begun to forge would either succeed or fail. And failure, he realized, wasn't an option. Not for Lerai. Not for her species. Not for him. The morning arrived in a somber gray haze, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Outside the reinforced window of the outpost, the barren, frozen wasteland stretched endlessly, the icy winds whipping through the snow. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tense. Adrian stood at the console, watching Lerai as she prepared for the final step of their plan. She was quiet, her movements precise and deliberate as she adjusted the calibration of the stabilizer device. Her silver hair caught the pale light, shimmering faintly as she worked, and her expression was one of unwavering focus. But Adrian noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way her jaw tightened when she thought he wasn't looking. She was nervous. Just like him. Lerai, he said softly, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, her luminous eyes meeting his. Yes. Are you sure about this? I mean, is there really no other way? For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she turned to face him fully. No, other way. Without Bond. My kind, gone. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability that Adrian hadn't heard before. It struck him that for all her advanced technology and alien grace, she was as fragile as anyone else when it came to matters of survival. And this wasn't just about her, it was about her entire species. The weight of that responsibility was staggering. Adrian exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay. What do I need to do? She stepped closer, holding the small circular stabilizer device in her hands. It pulsed faintly with a soft blue light, like a heartbeat. Sit, she instructed, her voice firm but gentle. He sat on the edge of the cot, his heart pounding as Lerai knelt in front of him. She placed the stabilizer against his chest, just above his heart. The cold metal sent a shiver through him, but it was quickly replaced by a strange warmth that seemed to radiate outward. This will connect us, she explained, her eyes never leaving his. Fully. Minds, bodies, life. Adrian swallowed hard. What happens if it doesn't work? Her gaze faltered for the briefest moment. If fail, both suffer. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of her words pressing down on his chest. But there was no time for second-guessing. Lerai's expression hardened with resolve as she pressed a series of buttons on the device. The blue light grew brighter, its rhythm quickening. Ready? She asked. He nodded, his voice caught in his throat. Yeah. The moment the stabilizer activated, Adrian felt an overwhelming surge of energy, as if a lightning bolt had struck him square in the chest. His vision blurred, and a sharp, almost unbearable heat spread through his body. He clenched his fists, his breathing ragged as the sensation intensified. Across from him, Lerai gasped, her slender frame trembling. Her hands gripped the stabilizer as if her life depended on it, her luminous eyes wide with both pain and determination. A faint, golden glow began to emanate from her, intertwining with the blue light of the stabilizer. Adrian's mind was flooded with a torrent of images and emotions, not his own, but hers. Memories of a vibrant, thriving world filled with laughter and song. The faces of her people, their features so similar yet distinct from hers. The devastation that followed, the skies darkening as fire rained down, leaving nothing but ash and silence. He saw her desperation, her isolation, the unbearable weight of being the last of her kind. And beneath it all, a flicker of hope, a fragile, flickering flame that she had carried across the stars in search of someone, anyone, who could help her reignite it. Lerai, he whispered, his voice trembling. Her gaze met his, tears streaming down her cheeks. Now, you see. The connection between them deepened, their thoughts and emotions intertwining in a way that defied explanation. Adrian felt her pain as if it were his own, her hope burning within him like a beacon. And she, in turn, felt his fear, his doubts, his overwhelming need to protect her, even at the cost of his own life. The stabilizer pulsed faster, the golden and blue lights merging into a brilliant white glow that filled the room. The heat became almost unbearable, but Adrian didn't pull away. He couldn't. He wouldn't. When the light finally subsided, Adrian collapsed back onto the cot, his chest heaving. The stabilizer fell to the floor with a dull clatter, its light extinguished. Larai sat back on her heels, her body trembling as she struggled to catch her breath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Adrian reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Did it work? She looked at him, her eyes filled with wonder and relief. Yes. Bond, complete. He felt it too, a strange, almost imperceptible shift within him. It was as if a part of him had been rewritten, his very essence altered in some fundamental way. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, deep down, that they were connected now. Inextricably. Irrevocably. What now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Larai smiled, a genuine radiant smile that lit up her entire face. Now, we rebuild. The following days were a blur of activity. Larai's equipment began to hum with new purpose, the once chaotic data streams now forming coherent patterns. She worked tirelessly, her movements filled with a renewed sense of determination. Adrian helped where he could, his newfound connection to her guiding him in ways he couldn't fully understand. Their bond wasn't just emotional, it was biological. He could feel her presence even when she wasn't in the room, a constant, comforting hum in the back of his mind. And she, in turn, seemed to draw strength from him, her once frequent hesitations replaced by quiet confidence. As the first signs of success began to appear, tiny, living cells multiplying in the nutrient chambers, Adrian couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Together, they were creating something new, something that had the potential to bring an entire species back from the brink of extinction. But it wasn't just about survival. It was about hope. About connection. About two beings from different worlds finding common ground in the face of insurmountable odds. On the final evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Adrian and Larai stood side by side, gazing out at the frozen landscape. We did it, he said softly, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. Larai nodded, her gaze distant but content. Not alone. He turned to her, his expression serious. Larai, what happens now? When your people come back, when there are more of you, what happens to us? She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with emotion. We find way. Together. Adrian smiled, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the heater. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. Like he had a purpose. And as he stood there, with Larai by his side and the first sparks of a new future glowing in the lab behind them, he knew that this was only the beginning. End of story.